Well, hello, welcome. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Erin Brown. I am Program Director for the Ignatian Solidarity Network. To those of you who have just joined, as you can see, people are introducing themselves and sharing where they're joining from and their institutions in the chat. We have a number of people from secondary ed, higher ed, ISN institutional members, as well as folks who are members of Education for Justice joining us today. So we're really excited that you're here. We have about 90 minutes and a pretty full 90 minutes. And I have a few hopes for us today. The first is that you find some community in this space to be with colleagues and educators who are doing similar work and perhaps facing similar challenges. And my second hope is that you can walk away with some concrete tools for engaging in conversation and challenging topics with your students. So I'm really excited that Amanda, Montez, and Jamal Adams are able to join us today. I hope that you all had the opportunity to watch their presentation from the 2020 Ignatian Family Teaching for Justice. If you didn't get around to it, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at it. Just to give you a little bit of an overview for our activities today, we're going to start with a Q&A with Amanda and Jamal. So if you have questions for them, we'll jump into that. I'll turn it over to the two of them. They'll lead you through an activity of norm setting so you can put those tools into practice for yourselves. And then, like I said, I want you all to be able to find space and community with one another. So there'll be time for some small group discussion, resource sharing if you wish. And then we'll come together as a large group again before we close for the day. But for now, I will turn it over to Amanda and Jamal.
All right, thank you, Erin. And again, welcome to everybody. I'm going to share my screen and just a couple different slides that we wanted to start with. And the first being just giving you an opportunity to get some contact information. Amanda and I are extremely excited. It's been my pleasure over the last, I would say, a better part of 6 months. I've been in close contact working with Chris Kerr and Aaron and Brenna and the whole Ignatian Solidarity team about bringing some of the things that we do in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space to a virtual space where we could share and learn from each other. And one of those things that came out of that discussion was an opportunity to talk about norm setting. So I want to talk a little bit about Amanda and I. We are both West Coast affiliated. You can see Amanda is at Sacred Heart Nativity School up in the San Jose area. I am the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Loyola High School in Los Angeles. And most importantly, we came together to help put together a project that our province got involved in called CORE, which is our collaborative organizing for racial equity. And there was a desire to kind of cull together and work on a toolkit that our communities could use to work our way through the racial reckoning of this past year that continues on to today. And in a really lucky way, Amanda and I were co-editors of that website and a lot of the language that welcomes you into that website. And at the beginning of all of that, we talked about the idea that how do we set this balance in this space to have these really critical, culturally relevant conversations. And obviously with the events of the last couple of weeks, I think it's only continues to heighten our need for that. I'll let Amanda talk a little bit more about herself when I pass it to her in a second, but I also want to make sure we make space for everyone to have questions. Before that, though, we wanted to yesterday, the two of us were part of our core meeting team, and our fearless leader, Annie Fox, put up this slide and this quote, and it's from Bernice King, daughter of the late great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is appropriate with his holiday coming up here in the next few days. And she says, kindness matters, but kindness does not equal justice. Civility counts, but calling for civility is not the humane response to injustice. Justice is. Love is essential, but love is not a passive, weeping bystander. Love puts in work. Additionally, she said something to this effect, and both of these things have been living in my heart for the last 12 to 16 hours, and that many of us that are in these spaces that want to create spaces for our students and colleagues to have these critical conversations are people that are in love with and furious with our traditions. And we want our traditions to live up to, to stand for what they say they stand for. I really think that's the spirit that Amanda and I come to you today to discuss, to create space for, is that we can be both in love and furious with the traditions, both in our institutions and most especially in our country right now. But we've got to keep putting in the work. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to Amanda. We've got a couple minutes of thoughts that we had preparing for this, and then we'll open up the Q&A.
Yeah, so hi everyone. So good to see you all. So I'm Amanda Montez, and like Jamal said, I am at Sacred Heart Nativity Schools. We've got 82 little ones here in San Jose. I'm the Spanish teacher, do culture and identity, parent ed, and then all sorts of core stuff. So I think for us, what our goal always is we are heavily Jesuit educated, and as being BIPOC people, we're always trying to create spaces that we wish that we had as students, and so really actively fighting for that. Today, what we really hope to do is to give you all the tools about how do we give you some norms that maybe you don't know about, maybe you'll be adding on to some of our lists. I think that this work identity work in general is always incomplete. We're always working on this. So I really hope that when we're thinking about these conversations that we're having with our communities, I hope that you're not going into this being like, well, it's just this month and we're good, right? We don't know the events of next week with the inauguration. And so always remember, these conversations are adaptable. These norms are adaptable. Maybe you'll use some in your classroom. Maybe you'll use some for a meeting that you have, and maybe you'll use some for these really tough conversations. And so with that, please make sure that you think of these as adaptable. They're not etched in stone. And also, you know your community's the best, right? So you're the ones who really, I can't say, oh, this is the fix-all, right? Like this is the magic pill for, these are the exact norms that make a perfect conversation. Humans are flawed, so there will never be a perfect conversation. I think that there's a lot of perfection in that imperfection. So just, I think, be gentle with yourself when you're navigating these conversations, and always remember like what key terms need to be defined. So for our conversations here at Nativity, right, I'm working with 6th through 8th graders. So in our anti-racism read, they're learning microaggressions, bias. Do you need to define that for your community? That might already be assumed knowledge. So always be sure that you are setting the groundwork for your students or for your faculty, for your community, because it could look different with each group. All right. So we do want to, oh yeah, go for it, Jamal.
No, I was just going to say at this point, I think before we do any breakout work, leaning on Aaron's suggestion for folks that have watched the video that we created back in November. Love to open up to any questions before we get you into an activity that we think is germane. So I want to make sure we make some space for anybody that may have walked in with any questions. It's hard to probably see everybody, at least I can't see everybody on one screen, so you might have to unmute yourself if you do. And if not, we could get into our work.
Jamal and Amanda, this is Phil Metris. So I teach at a university, and I'm grateful for this reframing of what was once called civil conversations or dialogue and that sort of thing. I think that that's really important right now. So I'm curious, I think along the way, it'll be interesting for us to learn not only how we facilitate ourselves these conversations, but also find ways of empowering students to be able to create their own spaces and conversations. And is there any difference between peer-to-peer sort of led conversations versus, faculty facilitated? So that's something that I hope we address.
Yeah, I think about this summer, Jamal and I were part of a conference with high school students, all from Jesuits West. And so we had alumni, but they were like brand new alumni, had graduated in May, and were facilitating for incoming juniors and seniors. So still all in the same age range. And they actually, I think students responded more strongly to the norms as their peers set them forward instead of rules coming from top down. one of the biggest shifts that we saw, a great norm is like call out any energy that's happening in the space at the time. And, you know, with Jesuit high schools, they tend to be predominantly male schools, and we had two Cristo Rey schools. And so there were a lot of white men in the space learning activism work, which was really exciting. And one of our facilitators was able to call out like, oh, who has been able to speak this morning? Who hasn't, right? And it was actually a really great check for our male students to go, oh, I need to step back. And I think it came so much more powerfully than if Jamal or I had said it, because it was just the peer-to-peer recognition.
And I would add on that, Phil, that I think maybe the most powerful norm that we often do, and we've been fortunate, Amanda and I have been fortunate to do a number of these things, is after we set some of the classic norms, is to ask that question: what else do we need? Because I do believe you're right there, that the audience and the ability to be adaptable is important if it's our colleagues or our students. But having a space, you know, we run something at Loyola called Words Matter, in which we invite Catholic students from all over the city to come together around these conversations, and we've been doing it for 3 years. And I would suggest to you, Phil, and to the greater audience, that when we open up to what we need, the young people always come up with something that we hadn't been thinking about, that may be germane to the current situation. What we do is we give space, we put that up on a larger board, so that lives and resonates in that time that we're together, right? It's about, you know, in a lot of ways, you know, with our faith, it's about, you know, creating a ritual that allows us to start on an even playing field, and in some space. And then the last part I would say to that too, that I'm really probably have a heightened awareness of now in the work that I'm doing, and continue to think about the crossroads we find ourselves in as a country, is the idea of really making sure that we're all talking about the same thing and defining the language or terms that we're talking about, as Amanda so eloquently talked about in her anti-racism work, or you know, what we kind of have to do today, actually, which is probably not a bad segue, is that we want to throw out, like, you know, 2 current events, and then maybe have you all get into small groups and think about those things, and particularly like what norms would you want to, and I would say to think about who's your audience, who's your classic audience? Is it students? Is it your colleagues? Is it maybe your faith community that you're praying with? And then 2, what language would you need to define, right? If we're talking about the racial reckoning of this summer post the George Floyd killing, you know, do we need to define? I know I found myself in a lot of spaces, Catholic spaces, that are really grappling with the idea of Black Lives Matter as an organization versus a movement. Like, do we need to define what we're talking about, so that doesn't derail our conversation, right? Somebody gets upset because they don't understand the term, or they understand the term as X and you or Y, and now in the middle of what is a productive meeting, we've gotten down to micromanaging language versus having set that at the beginning, so that we can have a common way or common language for us to discuss. So I think those are really powerful practices. You know, I teach in the classroom beyond just doing my diversity work at Loyola High, and I try to start every class talking about our core ways of proceeding, is what I'll say to them, or norms, just so that the guys, and they're all males in my class, are prepared to enter into robust discussions. So,
Question.
yep, I'm sorry, I can't see who that is.
It's Gina.
Hey, Gina, how are you? Oh.
Thank you. When you talked about micromanaging language and veering away from that, I think that that's a danger in those trying to establish norms in those conversations. In your experience, what are the ways that you avoid that, other than, like you said, putting up on the screen or offering? These are some of the norms that we have identified and experienced in our experience. Then what are some of the norms that you come up with, that you generate, depending on clearly what your audience is? But how do you avoid that? One of the things that came into my head is when you talked about, you know, the killing of George Floyd, as opposed to using the murder of George Floyd. And I thought to myself, how do we communicate the severity of that event while not veering into what you just said?
One, I think that's a great question. Thanks, Gina. And I definitely want to make sure Amanda has some space to retort. I would say, one, it's just in that space, Gina, I've been very specific about calling it the killing of George Floyd. And partly it's just because the legal proceeding hasn't played itself out just yet. He was killed. I have a political stance that believes he was murdered, but there is something to be said for allowing the legal system to work out. And I want to keep people engaged. I would say for me, and then I'll pass to Amanda. One of our norms that we use, and particularly I've used with both adults and kids, is the idea of oops and ouch, right? When aggrieved or when something happens that we may not agree with. And particularly, again, Gina setting this out at the beginning, that this is how we're going to, when we hear something that we disagree with, this is how we're going to proceed. We're going to say ouch, and singularly say ouch, and emphatically say ouch, so that the speaker, God willing, again, established on the front end, would then could say oops in terms of acknowledging that there is pain. And what I do, particularly with young folks, is I will tell them that we will make sure that we circle back later on and create an opportunity for some one-on-one. This happened last Thursday in our senior project. We got into a discussion with all 300 seniors talking about the Capitol siege. And
That's what I heard in my little breakout session too. Yeah.
And we had some kids that got, I thought there was some level of name calling. I know both boys, and so I was able to get both of them and grab them in a breakout room later and have a discussion. And again, it was sensational, and those that saw it, they were taken aback by it. But I think in a real way, I'm hoping to put those two kids and center them in a way that show that they can have that discussion in a public forum, some point later in this next semester. So, Amanda, I definitely allow you to expand.
I think you hit the nail on the head with it. I think also just something to note, when you're setting these norms, they're not something to be rushed, and so really wanting to make sure that you're using explicit, specific language, and making sure that people are on the same page and that people agree with them, so that you can, if there's a disagreement, go, okay, we need to stop because this is what we agreed to and we're not upholding the norms. I think that sometimes I think as a teacher where I'm like, I only have 50 minutes. What do you mean I need to do this for 25 minutes potentially? I think just be ready to slow down and take some time with norms, just so that you can get the language right for your community.
Awesome.
I had a question, if I could, before we go into breakouts.
Please.
I'm Pat Gallagher. I'm from St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland. When you're working with students in the K-12 space, you're building the rapport with them, you're partnering with them, and creating this setting around these norms where you can have a civil discourse is obviously important to all of us. Do you have any suggestions about how you partner too with parents, since you're dealing with K-12 students? And how do you bring parents into the conversation, especially since they're not in the classroom with you all the time? Zoom is obviously a little bit different these days, but in a traditional setting, what kinds of suggestions might you have?
Yeah, I would send out what norms you're saying, and I would say, anything. I think I'm a parent engagement coordinator, so maybe I'm a little biased, but I think trying to be as transparent as we can with families of these are the questions that we're going in with. These were some of the really powerful responses. These are the norms. I think that parents can tend to freak out when they feel like they don't know what's going on. And I think sometimes the more transparency we can have with them. I think that parent groups being able to talk about this, Jamal and I have talked about this, I think parent groups having the space to process through the events and how do we move forward as a school community could also be really powerful. So, and having norms so that they can practice it themselves, because I always question, how many people, if you've got kids, I know you've got so much to be worrying about right now during the quarantine. I do not envy that. And I know that it can sometimes feel like an extra meeting, but it could also be a really beautiful space for healing and for community building.
I would say, Patrick, your question is one that I think is at the core right now of the mission of our schools. I can only talk about secondary ed because I've been lucky enough to be involved in some of these discussions at the president's level and principal's level and the ISN and JSN and some of you, your colleagues at St. Ignatius of Cleveland and Deborah and Christian, who are my dear friends, and we are talking about this because this work is important. The kids want to engage. I think what is universally true is that our students want to engage in these conversations. However, our leadership are getting inundated with messages that this work is indoctrination and things of that sort. And so I would suggest multiple, in a lot of ways, what Amanda said is true, right? It's sharing the idea that we enter into these spaces from an educational standpoint. That's why we set norms, right? And why we set ways of proceeding that central to our mission as Jesuit educators, right, is to build people of conscience, of competence, and of compassionate commitment, right? That's like the operationalizing men and women with it for others really is around those 4 C's. And so that means we have to engage in dialogue and conversation. And so to ignore it or to skirt around it, I think is one of our issues. And I think I know there's some documents coming out, hopefully in the near term, from the JSN for the secondary folks that really call explicitly to the idea that being in an educational setting is political. It's just not partisan. And I think that's the thing that we should be engaging in, the idea that we're going to have political conversation, but we are not going to do it from a partisan perspective. We are hopefully, by doing our norms, we encourage all perspectives in the room, even when they're painful. God knows kids say some things that I can't necessarily agree with. And I'm always, to them, I'm asking them their sources and what defines, again, going back to language and what words we're using and what terms we're using to define, how they got to that conclusion, and examine that. I mean, think about, again, the idea of our Jesuit, charism to really be contemplative and reflecting on the crux of the roots of what we're getting at. So, but I do think I would suggest that where there is friction the most in these conversations, particularly at the secondary ed, I'll step there, is the idea of the parent response to our teachers and what have you. And God willing, principals and presidents are backing folks up. And or if I could be so bold, I would suggest that taking what we do today and going back to your leadership, and our leadership should be conducting their meetings this way. And parent outreach. I think the last thing I would say about that Amanda really highlighted, I think would be great, would be for our institutions, again, for our K through 12 institutions to be inviting parents. We did that this summer for our freshman orientation product or program that we put together that had a lot of cultural consciousness in it. And we had our incoming freshman parents involved in 3 or 4 nights on Zoom. And honestly, I think it was really helpful. The feedback we got from the parents was amazing, that they were illuminated to the mission and the way that we go about educating and informing their kids.
I also want to highlight, there's a question in the chat from Russell. When it comes to an oops and ouch moment, logistically, do you allow students who interject in this way to discuss the interjection, or is it just noticed and held on to later? So Jamal, I'm going to let you answer that one.
To that, Russell, I mean, I would, in some respects, this may seem like a cop out, I would say that's personal preference. My personal preference, and again, on the front end of doing our norm setting, is that I let the students know that I'm going to build time on the back end for that interaction, right? So that I can keep the momentum of what we're trying to get done or what have you. Not trying to be so expedient that we just run over people's feelings or what have you. But I think, again, and thinking about setting your norms, there's some personal preference, but I would, if that's an area that you want to emphasize, and I would suggest you do. Obviously, if you know that there's a controversial topic that may divide the room or the group, is that you be really clear about like the idea that there will be given space for that, but that we have some goals or some agendas that we want to get through, and then I will make time on the back end to have a more thorough discussion of what may have been that pain point in the conversation.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I was thinking about that also in relation to other thing that you had mentioned for going over shared language and just saying, here's our definition for how we are going to define XYZ terms. And I think that's really important, but also I think because some of these terms, there's a lot of parity in how people might define them and a lot of disagreement around privilege, racism, what have you, however we want to talk about it. And I think that, as you mentioned, that kind of allowing for that discussion or allowing for a collaborative defining of these terms might derail an entire presentation,
Right.
and so which in many cases is really great and productive to be able to come to. But I also wonder in that, just if you could speak to really quickly, is it kind of, hey, for interest of time, like this is how we're going to define these terms today, and we can talk more about, but like for the interest of our conversation, the purpose of our conversation, we're going to define them this way.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a great point, right? And I'm sorry, man. I would just say too, like part of it is like we have to reverse engineer how much time we're going to spend, right? If this is a drop in one time, let's talk about the Capitol siege, and then we're going to get back to algebra, right there. Then for that argument's sake, then I think you got to be really emphatic about your terms. There isn't any level discussion, and we're going to have this 1 hour discussion. If we're talking about this is a class, I teach African American history, right? And I spend an exorbitant amount of time in the first couple of weeks defining terms so that over the next 16 weeks, that when we're talking about bigotry or racism or whatever term that we might to work with, that we've defined that, we spent some time early on. Do we need to haggle over these intricacies so that what I want to be is, I always say this to our young men, is like, let's be really clear on what we're saying. It's not be ambiguous, right? And if if you staunchly want to, push forward an agenda that you believe in, then be really clear. I think that's at the root of why our kids take so much language, right? Is that we hope that we create citizens that are very clear in what they say, and that's I guess also that would be my 2 cents. Amanda, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's just like how much groundwork needs to be laid down. And I just always think about that. And we're always going to be coming back to that because if you set up this groundwork and it's a firm foundation, then it's going to lead for so much success. And so I think just definitely come back to that. And I think a way to do that, I'm seeing in the chat from Anita, I love the value certification that they mention of like polling people, where are you on awareness to the spectrum? Like, are you a newbie, a novice, or a lifer, right? Like I think just always kind of feeling the room and asking people how they're doing and calling out spaces like that, just like, how are we doing, is going to be super important for just open and honest communication. Another question that's in the chat is when cultivating a culture of curiosity or openness to hearing from multiple perspectives, is it ever helpful to exclude certain perspectives from the onset, or how do you navigate the introduction of an explicitly hurtful or hateful perspective, such as white supremacist position? I'll go ahead and start to answer that. I think, I used to teach the Catholic social teaching theology class to juniors. And I think whenever kids would be like, well, that's this political affiliation, I was like, well, this is what Catholic social teaching teaches us, right? Like, what are the grounds? What is the firm foundation of Catholicism and Catholic social teaching and Jesuit ideals that we have? And always lean on those. So something, I shared a document, and I'm more than happy to share it again. Let me put it in the chat really quick. Hold on. This is a Google Doc, and it is a living document, so please don't take this as etched in stone. But something that we made pretty specific is like, if you want to make acknowledgments, huge acknowledgments of like, this is who we are as a community, before you even set oh, we're going to respect each other, step up, step back, oops, ouch, like all those little norms. I think it's really helpful to use verbiage from your institution or mission statement, right? To say that like, we are a Catholic institution that believes in basic dignity of the human person. We denounce hate. I don't think that that's I think that that's a really necessary place to start and to ground people and to remind them of what institution that they're a part of. I think a lot of people after George Floyd's killing have been reckoning with, oh, this is actually what Jesuit institutions are, and this is actually what Jesuit educations mean. And so I think as clear and concise as we can be, again, some of these are when it comes to language around diversity, equity, access, identity, we make mistakes, but we got to keep learning. If we tell everyone this from the onset and know that, yeah, you're going to make a mistake, but remember that you're coming from a Catholic standpoint, I think that helps to just create a more inviting space that hopefully denounces hate. And frankly, in today's society, I think we're going to have to keep coming back to, well, that's not our norms. This is not what we uphold as an institution.
If I could add on to that, right? I think, thinking a lot about candidly, anti-racism, and then the derivations around that in terms of anti all kinds of other phobias and isms, right? Is central to this is this idea of liberation, right? That when we're having discussions, right, we equal outcomes, which would be great, and equitable and distributed outcomes would be awesome. But I think at hand right now in the work, the justice work, the Majus, right? The Majus is embodied in justice. It's about the liberation and the removal of barriers and obstacles that don't allow, or structures or systems that don't allow folks to live their best selves or recognize their full humanity. And I would continue to come back to I think that's a really good word to be defining on the front end, is what is liberation, and if that's at the core of loving our neighbor, and some of the 10 Commandments. I don't get off into too much theology, but just those are core tenets to all of our institutions for those of us on this call, I believe. And so, then I would ask those that are participating, right, to scrub their beliefs or their thoughts or their statements across those things. Are they do they lend to the oppression of any group or racial group of people or a group of people? That would be a litmus test for where it's at. But I also would say, right, while I'm also a big believer in that we call these brave spaces and not safe spaces, is that I don't know that we can mitigate 100% that civility and good manners and all of that stuff is going to be a part of these conversations. And I think the beauty of being human is that it's messy. And what we often do to stay comfortable is we just don't get in the mud and the muck to stay comfortable, and therefore we continue to perpetuate the status quo. So I don't want to get too far on my soapbox, but I believe that if there is an interaction that elicits rumors and things of that sort, again, if you've done your good, I'm preaching because this is what we do, but if you've done a good job with your norm setting, right, that's your fallback. This is the space we created. Sure, Pugsley said something that was of left field. It was dealt with this way, right, in terms of your leadership. And then how can we grow from this mistake or what have you? So that's why I also think this is such an important process in this work. So maybe, Aaron, we can pivot here. And I know Aaron and Brenna are working on getting folks into some breakout rooms. So this is what we thought. It was thinking about what we just did. The process that I want you to think about when you're in your breakout room is what norms. I think Amanda, gave you the Google Doc with some of the norms already. And also there's a Padlet in the chat for you to kind of record what comes out of your sessions. But we wanted to give you two case studies to think about while you're in your breakout rooms and having a discussion. And so the situations would be, what would be some of the norms and or some of the key terms that you might want to define if you were going to do two scenarios. One would be you and your students and or colleagues, want to have a civil discussion about the siege on the Capitol that happened last week. And then two, I would say the second question is one that I'm dealing with. Gina alluded to it earlier, and her question would be with our senior class at Loyola is this idea that with the unplatforming of the president from a multitude of social media platforms and the alleged decentering of conservative voices, one thing I hear in our work a lot is that there's no place for our conservative students to speak in what are considered liberal and progressive institutions, Jesuit institutions, how do we bring people together to talk about free speech and civil public discourse? I'll also add these questions. I think I copied them and
They're on the Padlet.
they're on the Padlet. Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're on the
So
Padlet.
hopefully,
Go ahead.
you're just in breakout rooms. And so if you can, so if there are, we want you to prioritize the discussion, right? That's number one importance. But I think always to have a living document about what you find is really important is always awesome, that we can share this as a resource for other people of just what do you think would be best, and think from your institution. You know, how many key terms do you need, right? You might not get them all, that's okay, right? How many, and maybe at least a few, what are at least a few norms that you would like to have as well?
So I think we're gonna put you guys, I forget if it's 15 or 20 minutes, in small groups. Well, hopefully that was fruitful. I mean, I'm looking at our Padlet. It seems like there was that most of our sharing is under the question around the siege on the Capitol. I'm not so sure how instructive it would be to, like, you know, read everything, and I appreciate maybe again, this is a link I might suggest everybody like open it up in a tab and keep it open, then folks can add to it later. I do, you know, in a real way, again, particularly for those of us in secondary ed, I think these are two really critical discussions, like in a real-time statement. You know, the siege, I think the deplatforming of social media, I think, is really germane to that age group. And how do we tackle those issues? I think are important. You know, and that's not to dismiss the idea that I think race is still central to our 2021 reality, and or, you know, and maybe most central is COVID, and all the different responses that we have in our different communities to being in class or not in class and things of that sort. So I don't know, Amanda, if there's something, if you want, we could do that. I could pull it up, but I'll lean on you at this point.
No, I mean, I think I was in a breakout room too, and we did not fill out the Padlet. So I would just say, well, I'm at fault for that too. We just got wrapped up in conversation, good conversation. So I hope that that's where you all were at too. So yeah, definitely keep it up so it can be a living document. Whatever works for you, maybe something else resonated during your conversations. I say, Jamal, if you have the slides up to just move to the
second questions. Yeah. Okay, let's do that. Let me do this. I'm gonna throw it in the chat before I pull up the slides. But we thought that, and I'm gonna guess off of what were awesome conversations. I would say we do one more round in small group, and those questions would be, you know, what are the greatest barriers to having open conversations? I guess in your context, we put classroom because that's our context, but and what are some of the tools? Obviously, we talked about norm setting. I know in our breakout rooms, we continue to have more conversations about what tools might be helpful. And then as an educator, what else could you need support in? And what I would say is that maybe when we come back for our last gathering, we could put some of those things in the chat. I will challenge you, or I'll challenge even myself. I know I have been blessed to be, like I said, to be working very closely with Aaron and Chris. One of our goals in our partnership between some of us practitioners in the DEI space and ISN is to create a repository or a place for folks to come and get training or tools or what have you. And so, you know, answering these questions would be really instructive, I think, for us to continue to build on that as the year goes on. That's something that we want to address in 2021. So, Brenda, maybe I would imagine shuffle everyone again, and that hopefully you have the two questions in the chat. I'm not going to pull up the screens to slow us up, but again, what are the greatest barriers to open conversation in your classroom? Are there tools that you have used that have helped you navigate those? Maybe they're outside of norms. This would be a great place to share in community. And then two, as an educator, Where have you needed support in facilitating challenging conversation? How have you been able to find that support? If so, where? And if not, maybe are there places that we can go to? So um, thank you all for, the second round, and look forward to seeing you back in about 15 minutes. I think at this point, and I don't see Amanda. I don't know if that's just the way my tiles are on my screen. At this point, I think I would suggest two things. I mean, one, if there's anyone that wants to share anything they thought was really powerful from either one of the breakouts, this would be a great time. And we don't have anything else necessarily prepared at this point, just maybe some larger group share outs. I'm going to throw my email in the chat. I most certainly am open to anybody that wants to reach out to me. And I'm sure Amanda will do the same. And
I will do the same thing.
And then we can kind of go further. But if there's anyone that would love to like maybe share out an experience in either of the breakouts that they think might be germane to the group, I'd love to hear from you, or we'd love to hear from you.
I'll go ahead and tap in here. This was a question that came up in my first group. And it was around kind of barriers, which was really more along the second session, but I think it's really important to address. And I don't want to claim to have the answers, because I don't at all for this. So I'm looking for the advices of the masses. But in this time, when having difficult conversations and looking to set norms, we are accosted with the barrier of distance and not a trust already being established. And that makes it difficult to have some of these more challenging conversations. And what advices do we have to build that trust, to set the norm and break down the barrier in this digital, impersonal world of which we currently reside?
Awesome, Christian. I think my last breakout, we actually kind of tackled this, and I would suggest, I don't know how many of you guys have seen it, and if you haven't, I would highly suggest you see it on the night when the Congress came back into chambers after the siege. Representative Ben Sass did like his 5-minute talk, and one of the things he said towards the end of it was something to the effect of like, "And go shovel someone's snow. It's hard to hate somebody who shoveled, your yard," or what have you. And what I would argue is this, Christian, like, right, the crux of having these conversations, right, is that, and oftentimes why people get so angry and emotional, is that there's this lack of belonging to what you get at, right? And so maybe what might be the best first norm in norm setting is the idea of narrative and story sharing and building a rapport, even on Zoom. So in some respects, right, we continue to like denigrate the idea that we're looking at boxes and what have you. But the other thing that's kind of interesting, and we just did this in this breakout, is that because of this technology, we can get into small groups and we can have small intimate discussions, come back. Imagine doing this like live. All the time we would lose from people moving from small group back to larger group. Like what we just did in an hour and 15 minutes probably would have taken us 2 hours, 2.5, because there's all this dead air time. So I would argue that one of the things that might be really, I mean, if you're thinking about a group or your class or what have you, is what are some building blocks on getting to know somebody. My good friend Angie was talking about 2 lies, and I'm sorry, 2 truths and a lie as like as a icebreaker. Questions around, who someone is or their favorite memory, or, building commonality. I know with our whole senior class, we did that last week to start our senior project off virtually. We spent almost a whole day having the kids tell stories and breaking them out around. And the feedback was, these boys that have been going to school together for 4 years are like, wow, I didn't know that. I learned so much about those couple different guys that were in my breakouts that I've been going to school with, obviously virtually the last 9 months. I think we underestimate how well these kids know each other, or excuse me, our constituencies know each other. They could be colleagues that work together for 15 years. My suggestion would be that there's some team building and some story sharing and some narrative and some building of community and mutuality and kinship that will then help foster any conversation after that.
I also think like the I am from poem does that too, and is like a fill in the blank poem about like telling people where you're from. And that's a really easy one. And I've used that with adults. I've used that from middle schoolers to adults. And just to be able to, yeah, share a bit about who you are, because I think that it's hard to fight someone when you've like fight with someone or argue with someone when you've just heard their story and their narrative. So again, I mean, it's how long is this all going to take? Like, luckily, I think that the beauty of Zoom is that like we get to decide that, right? That like everyone's schedules are coming together and looking really unique and different. And so, yeah, definitely take the time to build in any community building that you can.
Jamal, one of the tools that we used in that cultural consciousness building workshop that was an ongoing opportunity for our community is being randomly assigned to a partner and interviewing them. Yeah. And then you were charged with being that person afterwards, and then having other people be able to ask you questions. And after that exercise, it's sort of like, wow, I didn't know that about you, and I can't answer that question. Or I'm looking at them going, I can't answer that question about you. I mean, about me, right? So it was the blurring of those lines, and then really realizing that humanizing each other, that mutual storytelling, which in my head is the best way to, like you said, bring folks together.
That's a great one. And if you process it well, you can process it into how we all make assumptions about people and how dangerous those assumptions can be.
Amen. In my senior processing group yesterday, one of the kids had a placement at a homeless shelter in Hollywood. And one of the exercises they did for the kids was, what are some of the myths about people who are unhoused? And then addressing that with actual data. Right? It's amazing how that can help expand someone's self-awareness. It not necessarily is that we're not trying to fix anybody, but it's sort of like, here's the, this is our visual. And then what's the data? What are the other experiences? What's the lived experience behind that?
No doubt about it. I think, Gina, and I think one of my favorite parts about that is the idea of active listening too, right? And are we really listening to internalize information? And when we do that, Gina's gone through my training, but our training, we don't tell our constituency that they're going to have to remember and then be the other person, which I think also heightens, the next couple of rounds where we switch, how much one needs to be listening and taking in information.
So. I liked your new term, constituency. I caught that. I'm curious. I think a lot of difficult, unproductive conversation often happens when you just run into somebody at the local convenience store, standing in line at the grocery store, or whatever, and they say, "Well, what do you think about this? And what did you think about that?" You don't have the opportunity to get to know the individual. And so the question I have is it worthwhile even trying to engage them in conversation? Which I would think it is, I hope it is. But then what would be a norm, or the norms, or some norms that one could engage in or utilize to engage an individual in a conversation that might be uncomfortable, but doesn't allow time for that you get to know them?
I mean, I think that these norms are kind of lend themselves more towards like classrooms and community spaces. I don't know that, I mean, I love the idea, right, of like, we tend to make so many public spaces private, right? We have in our headphones, we are wearing masks. But I think that there's also something really beautiful about like the organicness of a one-to-one, of just like meeting somebody exactly where they're not and not putting rules onto it. But I think that norms are more used to just hold us all together when there's a larger group that needs facilitating.
Yeah, I think of a norm as kind of a rule of thumb that one employs to to be able to relate to the other person better. I don't know how else to put it. It's something you might use intuitively when you encounter somebody one-on-one. But some people aren't so intuitive that way and might have to, actually think in their head, well, I shouldn't use this kind of verbiage. I shouldn't react this way when they use that kind of verbiage. I'm just wondering what can be done. How
I mean,
can we engage?
I would say, like, I think norms help define the sandbox that we're playing in.
Mm,
It gives parameters to the space that we're going to occupy,
yeah,
right? And it allows us to call out folks that get out of bounds. Call out, I would say, remind folks,
Call
call
in.
out, yeah, might be strong,
Call in,
right?
call out.
Call in, right, and bring them back into the sandbox.
Uh,
Remind them that these are the sandbox. Obviously, I mean, I think
the
the
ouch
art
that
of
hurt.
101, yeah, the art of a 101 is different than norm setting. I think that it's also extremely vital. The playbook of community organizing is built around really effective 101s. And that could be a whole nother, I would suggest, if you don't know her, holler at Annie Fox. And I've been lucky enough to be taught by her, but I think there's an art to the 101, which is also very, very powerful. But I think it's a little bit different than norm setting.
Mm. Thank you.
Mhm.
We're about 3 minutes to the hour, so I'm going to leave Amanda and Jamal with any space for closing thoughts before I wrap up.
Yeah,
Great.
just wanted
Thank
to
you.
thank you all for being here.
Yeah.
Thanks
Yeah,
for
thank you for
having us.
joining the space. And again, I think our emails are in the chat. And I'll throw it one more time so it's at the bottom of the chat. And I mean, Amanda and I are in constant conversation about projects and things that we're doing. We're trying to build something for the summer for West Coast high school students that we're trying to expand around, getting to know each other and community organizing. Please be in conversation with us if we can help.
Yeah, always feel free to reach out, even if it's just a phone call or a Zoom. We're happy to bounce ideas. I think we've gotten pretty good at that with a lot of different institutions and trying to fit the needs of your community.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Jamal and Amanda, for being with us today, and to all of you for participating and hanging on. I know it's a long conversation, but again, I really appreciate you sticking with us and really your involvement and participation throughout that time. You all are here because you are connected to ISN through likely the institutions that you work for or through Education for Justice. Let us know what we can continue to do for you. I love the opportunity to allow ISN to serve as a convener. So if there are conversations that aren't happening within your institutions or, spaces for sharing resources or experiences that you would like to continue to have with people across the network, feel free to reach out to us. I too will drop my email in the chat. I know a few of you were talking about different resources and things and sharing documents. I'm happy to do that as well. I will share the recording of today's conversation. If you have things that you want to drop in there to share with others, I'll also include the links that Jamal and Amanda shared throughout our conversation today, so you can look for that email.
Can I do one more plug, Erin? There's another group, I just put their chat in there, that we contracted at Loyola to help us with some civic education that does norm setting and training and looking at the community from a civics lens. I must admit, the CEO is a good friend of mine and a mentee of mine from Columbia. But I put the link in there. They're wonderful. They've done a great job with us, and I just told them I'd plug them. So if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to myself or Dr. Jesse Rodriguez at Loyola High School.
Thank you all. Have a lovely
Thank you all.
afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank